Hey guys, Drifter here. Today I've got a video for you about my grandmother because as you may have seen on Twitter, she recently passed away, and by the time that you're watching this video, I'm going to be on a tiny single propeller airplane flying right back to the Mississippi Delta. But instead of being sour and negative and down, I wanted to talk about my grandmother's life today and some exceptional things about it because she was a very important person to me. I know that not everybody is that close to their grandparents, so when they pass, there's some distance, but for me, my grandmother helped raise me in a very significant way. It was like having a second mother, and since this is still a gaming channel, there has to be gameplay going on around me, which today is World War Z. Perhaps not the most appropriate of gameplay when we're talking about dead relatives. However, I don't have many gameplays banked, and I have to get on that airplane very soon, so we're making do. And you know what? My grandmother always had a good sense of humor, so I don't think she would mind a whole lot. Here are some pictures of us from the last time we met. This is my grandmother at 92 years old in the nursing home that I put her in because she has some dementia type issues. But in many ways, my grandmother was the bedrock of our small family. She was smart, kind, but opinionated. Sassy would be a different word for it. She worked very hard her whole life. She was very financially successful. She supported the family a lot. And my grandmother had a lot of good quotes. I'm going to go through two of them very briefly. Number one was when I was late to lunch and I decided to park my vehicle at home and then walk to my grandparents' house, like a 1-minute walk. And as I was coming in through the back, the door was open and I could hear my grandfather yelling and complaining and moaning about me being late and needing to be on time. And where the hell is he? He called my cell phone, he called my house, I didn't answer, and my grandmother's answer was, "Did you check the Chinese girl's bed?" And my grandfather got super pissed off. He would never. And she's like, "What the hell do you mean he would never? He spends every night at her house," just laying into him, which was pretty fun. And there was another time when I was getting ready to marry Jessica. I decided to tell my grandmother about it first before anybody else in my family. And when I told her about it, she says, "Oh Lord, you've done screwed up." It's like, "You are too young to get married." And she says, "But you know what? I'm not going to try to convince you not to do it, because if you've worked up the courage to tell me, that means you're damned and determined to do it, and I'm not going to waste my breath. I just hope you have a good marriage and this isn't practice for your second one." So perhaps not the most supportive. She actually didn't mind that Jessica was Chinese. It was just more that she thought we were both very, very young. But it was also respectful in a way that she understood me well enough to know that when I said I was going to do something, I was going to do it. My grandmother's life is kind of crazy. She grew up in the Great Depression of the 1920s and 1930s. She grew up in the Great Depression, which was the 1920s and 1930s. Yes, it was that long ago, and yes, she's that old. This was a completely radically different time than what we're used to. This is where electricity was not necessarily widespread. Horse and buggies still existed. The mechanization from World War I didn't catch on like it would later for World War II. There was still a lot of sharecropping and subsistence farming. It was a very, very poor time, and the economy crashed. And she had a lot of stories about being poor, mostly about having no money and having to save for everything. But not only was there no money, unlike today, there was no jobs to make money. Today, in most places in the US, if you want a job, you can get a job. It may not be a glamorous or great job or the job you want, but you can get a job. In the Depression, there were no jobs. Don't care what degree you've got, don't care how skilled you are, don't care how good you are at working, don't care about your specialty. Just can't hire you. There's nothing available. There was very, very little work to be found during the Depression, and because you have no money and no way to make money, food was limited. They had to save food, scavenge for food, scrounge for food. She talked about doing the stamps and the rationing in World War II. Hunt for food. That was something that men did when they could not find jobs, or perhaps they were just lazy. They would go hunting and kill some sort of animal, but everybody was hunting animals, so even they were scarce. There was no electricity. It wasn't widespread at the time, and they certainly couldn't afford it. You'd eat meat like once a month, maybe. Rest of the time would be like vegetables and bread. No cars. You just walk everywhere, maybe hitch a ride in somebody's like wagon or something going to town, because they lived in the country. And her parents were kind, though, because at this time it was also traditional to have an adult table and a kids table. And the way this would work is the adults would go sit at their big table and they would eat. And then when the adults were done eating, they would take the scraps and take it to the kid table, and the kids would eat whatever is left over, which is like chicken feet and like the ends of vegetables and like chewed up pieces of bread and stuff. But her parents decided that was totally BS and fed her normally. My grandfather had to eat scraps at the kids table, but they let her eat regular food, which was very kind of them. However, as she says, the family did have to entertain the pastor every now and then. He was the pastor in a relatively small community of a couple hundred members in the church, and what he would do is every Sunday he would go eat dinner at some other church member's house. And they would always wear their Sunday finest for the pastor and put on a big show for him and cook the best meal for him. So every Sunday, the pastor got the best meal that any of his people could afford, and he was, as she said, just about the only fat person in town. The pastor did very, very well for himself. As a young woman, my grandmother worked a series of menial jobs for a couple of years. Very small one. It would be similar to our kind of minimum wage work, secretary, the lady, just little kind of demeaning jobs for the most part. But she decided to better her life and apply to be a telephone operator for AT&T. This was Bell Telecom way back in the day. I'm going to say AT&T because she worked for the company that would eventually become AT&T, but it wasn't AT&T back then. Yeah, telephone operator. That's back in the days before phone calls were completely automated. That wasn't even like back in the 90s you'd hit 0 to talk to an operator, or 411 or something. This is like you'd pick up the phone and hit a button and an operator would be there and they'd be like, connect me to number 12, please. And they just beep up, connect to number 12 on the big switchboard, because you didn't even have enough phones to go all the way up into 4 digits. They'd kind of top out around 200 or so. And that's the job she wanted. She wanted to work the switchboard as a telephone operator and help people make calls, and it paid well too. So her and about 100 other young women applied for this job, but before they would let anybody work this job, they had to do an intelligence test. I don't know if it was because they looked down on women or they just didn't want to hire country bumpkins on accident or what, but they gave every single applicant some form of an IQ or ASVAB kind of test. It was just sort of a general practical knowledge and intelligence test. And my grandmother scored the highest out of all candidates. As a matter of fact, she got all questions right and was done the fastest, so she got the highest possible score. None of the other women were really even close. So the managers at the time made the unusual decision to offer her a job in the engineering department at what would become AT&T. Needless to say, the other women were super salty about it because they got much lower paying operator jobs, but my grandmother started off as an assistant to the engineers. She was kind of like a tech, or maybe like a gopher or an intern. She did a lot of, honestly, menial labor for engineers, but it was still a higher classification of work. She kept doing this for a long time and got better and learned more and more about what was going on. And keep in mind, this was in 1939. It was extremely rare for women to have non-secretarial jobs in 1939. World War II hadn't even really started yet for America, so that, like, woman flexing with her wrench and saying, we can do it, that wasn't really the thing. This was even before that. So it was extremely rare to see. And she didn't even think about herself as breaking glass ceilings. She was just poor, and she wanted money to eat with, so this was a job to make money to provide for her and her family. After about 3 years of working there, she eventually got promoted, and then promoted again, and then promoted again. And eventually, she was actually put in charge of the engineering department to manage the engineers. And it was one of those sort of business school decisions at the time to take a non-engineer and put them in charge of engineers to prevent the groupthink from beginning to get too extreme. But since my grandmother had worked there for long enough, and she'd been there longer than most of the engineers had, they thought that it would be a good idea to get an outside person to manage that position. So she was the boss of many engineers, and then some years after that, she would be promoted to a leadership position at a corporate branch, which is a really, really high place for a woman to be at the time as well. And it was really kind of crazy looking back to think that she was working as an engineer or with engineers in the 40s. And funny story, the former CEO of AT&T worked under her in her lab when he was a kid and she was older. And then much later in life, long after she had retired, she'd kept in touch with him and found out that he became the CEO. They did something that changed her 401k or her pension or something. The money didn't come. She got mad and she didn't call customer support. She literally called the CEO, and it was fixed in like 2 days. It was donezo. So that was impressive for me as a kid. So moving back to more stuff about me and how she affected my life, because that's sort of like a history lesson we just did. My parents divorced when I was very young. I really have no memories whatsoever of them being a couple or living together, with the exception of the day that my mom left for good. I remember that day, but I don't remember anything else. My mom didn't get custody of me, and my dad had a lot of work to do, so he couldn't be there for me all the time. And ultimately, my grandmother and grandfather raised me, especially when I was very young. When I was very, very young, I spent a lot of time with them. And for a while when I was little, I didn't know that my grandmother wasn't also my mother. I had a nanny that I was really close to, and a mammy. That's an entirely different weird thing that we don't want to get into. But it's mostly my grandmother. I thought she was my mom. I kind of lost track of what mom was for a little bit. And most of my early big moments, like walking and potty training and talking and reading and stuff like that, she was there for those things, helping me through them. She also took a beating or two on my behalf as well. Not every story was happy. When I was little, there were some rough ones, but I clearly remember her getting hit in the face with a belt quite a few times, so that it wasn't me getting hit with the belt. So she took a lot of L's for me, and I can appreciate that. And that would stay the same for most of my life. Even when, I got like 7 or 8, I went to stay with my dad and then my mom and then back. And as an older kid, I actually lived with my parents instead of with my grandparents, but I was always close to my grandparents. I'd visit frequently. I'd stay the night sometimes. They'd take me to church. They had a lot of say and control in my life, and they were a big part of my life, especially my grandmother. My grandmother and grandfather together helped pay for my college, mostly through clever investments. She invested a lot of the money that she earned from AT&T into stocks and other investments, so she was doing okay. But in the early 80s, I think it was even before I was born, they were planning on my father having a child, and they knew the interest rates were super high at that time because of inflation. So they took out all these CDs at like crazy high interest rates and crazy like 25-year periods and stuff like that. And it just compounded very hard, and it made a lot of money. So their small investment helped pay for my college. She helped me while I was in college with little money and gifts and here and there, which is crazy to think because I had scholarships, I had grants, I had certificates, I had machinima money, and college was still incredibly expensive. I barely got out debt-free. I got out broke, really, as a matter of fact. And she helped support my dad as long as she could. My dad had a lot of sprees of unemployment or getting fired or economy's rough or something, and she was just kind of always there for him, helping just about anybody in the family. So she also bought me my first car. If you go way back in time, before I was driving Tesla, I was driving a 2011 Elantra. That was my college graduation gift, and I still have it. It still performs great. She got me that. And my grandmother would stay active and stay busy until she was 88 years old. Around age 88, the dementia finally hit, and we ultimately had to put her in a home for her own safety. Her body was in good shape, but the dementia prevented her from taking care of herself properly and eating properly and a lot of sort of basic life functions. The dementia would become very severe, and my grandmother, as you know, passed away. She'd pass away 5 years later. She's 93 years old. She kind of passed away a few years ago already. There wasn't a lot of grandma left up here. Dementia is kind of scary. You just watch people waste away. Their brains don't work. Hardly any, if at all. She essentially regressed back to being a child before passing. And I could talk a lot. My grandmother made mistakes in her life. She did bad things. I know about those. But today is a positive video. Today is to celebrate a life and talk good about somebody and leave some sort of lasting memory instead of worrying about a lot of negative stuff. And that was my grandmother, a kind-hearted woman with a smart-ass mouth who was a few decades ahead of her time in work, and she has passed on, as we all shall. So all I can say is, Grandma, I guess I'll be seeing you again in 50 or 60 years. Drifter out.